Welcome to the Connectomics Podcast. Here we talk to theorists and practitioners about how notions of embodiment can help us to connect an understanding of ourselves with an understanding of the cultural, technological, and ecological worlds of which we are part. I'm your host, Mark Michael James. I'm a cognitive scientist and philosopher at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology in beautiful Okinawa, Japan. Our podcast guest for this, the 9th episode, is Andrea Hiott. Andrea is a writer, a neuroscientist, and a philosopher, and she's presently pursuing a PhD under the supervision of Dr. Thomas Fuchs in Heidelberg in Germany. Thomas, who many of you listening will be familiar with. So why did I invite Andrea on the podcast? Well, I met Andrea last year at a conference. Well, initially, actually, at a workshop that me and Tom Froese were hosting, but later throughout a conference that we were both attending on phenomenology and the emotions in Heidelberg in Germany last year. And we had some good chats there. And as part of those chats, Andrea really emphasized to me that she was developing or working on an approach to understanding cognition, primarily as a means of navigation, or of what she calls waymaking. This approach to cognition, I wanted her to come on and speak about, and indeed that ends up being the main topic of our conversation. But in, dare I say, making our way, we passed through a bunch of interesting related topics, including philosophical or epistemological perspectivalism, process philosophy, how experience and adoption of particular epistemic frames relate to each other, how a history of experience, you might say, and convergences between our own life experiences and how they appear to be manifest in our thinking and how we approach the world. And I should say a bunch of other stuff. This was genuinely a fun conversation. I really feel a kindred spirit in Andrea, and I feel like we could have talked for multiple hours more. What I was left with, though, was I think, leaving this conversation and listening back, a sense for the power of metaphor, even and maybe even particularly so in our scientific life. Metaphors not only help us get a grip on the world around us, but they invite us into certain modes of inquiry. The metaphor of navigation is genuinely a powerful one, and for a multitude of reasons as we get into in the podcast. But what has kind of remained with me is the sense of situatedness that it fosters. We are not in this metaphor, very obviously, the, say, mediators of a controlled hallucination, but agents making our way in the world. And there's something transformative about that, something worth, dare I say, continuing to pursue. One could go, dare I say, a long way with these waymaking navigational metaphors. And in a sense, that's kind of the point. Before getting into our conversation, I want to let you know that we're going to be changing the name as some of the general framing of the podcast. I'll talk a bit more about that very soon. But briefly, the name of the podcast is changing to Learning to Care. And I'm doing that because I want the emphasis to be a bit more targeted within the podcast, the kinds of conversations we have and so on. And what I want to look at, because this is kind of core to my work and my interests, is understanding the science philosophy and practice of what we might broadly think about as balancing care across different scales. So care for ourselves, care for each other, care for the planet. So in it, we're going to be taking both a kind of critical look at, for instance, things like the wellness industry and its relationship to things like systematic concerns like, I don't know, the climate crisis, or more general, more localized, but still nevertheless structural or systematic concerns. But we won't be stopping at the critique. The whole ambition of the podcast will be to explore with our guests alternative possible futures, and how those futures become aligned across scales of what we do in our individual lives and so on, feeds or contributes in complex ways, obviously, but, wondering if we can look at some of those traces to what we do at scale and whether taking care at a local level equates to, or how it might equate to also taking care more globally or universally. Excitingly, I might also have a co-host joining me, but more about that some other time. Just before we start here, I just want to say that we really do appreciate your support and hope you're enjoying the show. We hear from a lot of you that indeed you are, so that keeps us going. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our podcast so you never miss one. And if you're enjoying the show, we'd be really grateful if you could leave us a review. Your reviews do help us reach more listeners and really get to more people. And spread the word. If you know somebody who might be interested, somebody who needs a little bit more connection, needs a little bit more learning to care going forward, a little bit more care or maybe a little bit more learning. Spread the word, please. And I think that's it. Without further ado, I bring you a conversation I had with Andrea Hiott sometime in, I believe, December of last year. And it took us a while to get this one out, just there's so many things going on. But here it is. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. So where are you?
I'm in the Netherlands, actually. We're moving here. So this is like a Airbnb. It's kind of not but it's very colorful and nice. But I'm in Zeist. You ever heard of it? It's near Utrecht. It's about 40 minutes from Amsterdam.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's where you're moving to?
We were looking for a place. We found a place. Starts like mid-December. I still have my place in Germany too, but my partner will be working here and stuff. So it's only like four hours drive, which for an American is not that bad.
Yeah. For someone living in Okinawa, that sounds like 5 trips around the island. So it's
absolutely. Well, I think it's the same for Holland because everything here is like 1 hour away from everything else. So when I say, my house is only 4 hours from here, people are like, what?
Yeah. It's funny that, right? Like space compresses and then the space within the space expands somehow.
It is. It's relative, right? Space and time. I remember we moved a lot when I was a kid. And I remember the first time we moved, which was only like 45 minutes away from my grandparents, right? But when we would go visit my grandparents, who I'd lived basically right beside of till then, I would like pack snacks and my pillows and like blankets because 45 minutes felt like huge, right? Because I'd never been so far. And now it's like, whatever, you drive that to the airport. But back then it was like, I felt like I was going on a day trip, have to like take my stuffed animals, get some snacks.
Yeah, totally. I know, we used to joke that I grew up in a peninsula in the west of Ireland. We used to joke that like if you were going to the nearest town, which was it was like 30 minutes away, but like you'd warn the neighbors a week in advance. You know,
exactly. That's how it was for me till we moved. Yeah. It's funny though. It really changes, you know, just based on experience. I guess that's a matter of patterns, right? The patterns you get used to.
Yeah, sure. And then, I mean, if you're in somewhere like Australia, you know, where you have to fly to work kind of thing, or I guess parts of the States too, you know, you're kind of used to big, long hauls.
Yeah, it's pretty normal there. I mean, a lot of people drive an hour to work, so.
Right. Well, this is kind of a interesting lead into what aims to be our conversation anyway, right?
So, right, space and time.
Right. So it hasn't been a bad starting point, but we've met before, just to give our listeners a bit of a sense. We met recently at a conference in Heidelberg, had some good chats, and you at that time were reflecting on, I guess it's what is to be your PhD project. Am I right to say that?
That's true. Mm-hmm. I'm starting it. I'm already doing it. Yeah.
Okay. So you're how far in? You're just started, or you're?
I'm just starting, more or less. But actually, it's kind of for me something I've been working on for a long time, and I'm actually doing the PhD just more to formalize it. So it's kind of, you know, a larger philosophy or perspective that I've been working on in different ways. Not the most traditional, a little bit unorthodox. But just for the sake of like rigor and to kind of really test everything, I wanted to actually do it in an academic environment. And so that's what I'm doing. But yes, as far as like research and writing and thinking, I've been doing this quite a while. But actually writing the PhD with Thomas Fuchs in Heidelberg, that's just starting.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, just to kind of set the scene here a little bit then. So the topic of your PhD, or the general orientation, is to really bring a kind of relatively novel, from my experience at least, understanding of cognition to our understanding of what cognition is, right? So you have in mind the notion of cognition as a form of navigation. And I guess we can start to tease that out and come back to it, but that's just to kind of set us up. But I guess our listeners would be super interested to hear about what your background is. You said that you've been working on this for a while, so I guess within some formal capacity that has been the case. Maybe you can just tease out some of that for us and bring us back to this idea eventually of cognition as navigation.
Sure. I mean, that it's itself kind of an example of this idea of navigation. But yes, I mean, early on when I first did my bachelor's, which was over a decade ago, actually, I was already interested in like trying to think of mind as somehow relative to movement and action, and finding some kind of way of thinking of cognition as active, but also as a behavior, right? So that early work I did a lot with Hegel, but I also studied like physics and science, and I was trying to put these ideas together. And so I've been thinking about it since then, but I also did a lot of unorthodox research and study. For example, I worked in Mongolia for some years on different historical projects. I've studied different kinds of history. I have degrees in other subjects, and I've also studied technology a lot. It's a big interest of mine. But all these kind of pursuits have always been through this framework of like, how can we understand cognition in a different way? And mostly, I mean, a lot of my studies have also been environmental, like place related, like how does place change thought and feeling and memory? So I was also really trying to connect ecologically, cognition, mind, how do we think of it ecologically? That's just kind of been my trajectory in many different ways. I've moved a lot, I've lived in a lot of different places, I've studied a lot of different subjects, I've written books on things like art, but also things like automobiles. But for me, it's always framed through this idea of how do we make our way in the world? Like, how do we navigate? What is that? And how does that relate to how we build the patterns of our thought, feeling, memory? Yeah, so, cognition in general, but also more specific, like mind-based questions.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much in there. I was looking for a pen and a notepad as you were speaking, because you were saying lots of things that I'd like to get back to.
Yeah.
But maybe, so you said that there was something about movement in particular, and I guess that brings in the body straight away.
Yeah.
That kind of piqued your interest here a little bit. Was it the fact that you were involved in some sort of physical practice? Was it the critique of existing paradigms? Was it just coming across embodied literature? Was it a combination of all of those things? I mean, I guess the notion of movement is kind of present for people, but then there's another level or two of abstraction before we get to something like navigation. So I guess that evolved over time. But yeah, was that starting point maybe a little more definitive?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that I've always been interested in pursuits that people often see as oppositional, or that, for example, you shouldn't be interested in analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, or, you should choose one, or you shouldn't be, it's changed a bit, in the past decade, but at that time it was more like you either choose neuroscience, which I was interested in, or the study of the brain, or you choose philosophy. And I sort of wanted to do both, So I feel like what I was really trying to do was find a different way, something that was in common to, for example, mental, physical, spiritual, virtual, social. And I think over time, I've just sort of found this paradigm of navigation, or waymaking is what I call it, to be something that you can really use to approach how we understand thought, feeling, and memory from any of those angles, without having to kind of like judge them, right? And say, if you read certain writers in one tradition, then you can't also use the work from another tradition. I feel like the paradigm I've been trying to kind of build over this time, or even just like research and discover from other people's writing, is a way of doing that, right? Like movement, not only physical movement, but mental, movement, how we grow, how we change perspective. But also social, right? How we find our way through social encounters, how we learn how to communicate better, and also with ourselves, right? How we learn how to deal with our own patterns and change them. And so I guess I just found navigation to be the right framework for that, but it's definitely been a lot of my own movement, physically, mentally, and spiritually, right? My own reading and discussing these subjects with others. So yeah, I'm not sure if that really answers how movement in a broad sense goes to navigation more specifically, but.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so. For me, I get that in a super intuitive way. I mean, there's some sort of eerie similarities, it seems, between our own histories. My own history was one of practice too, and art, and being involved in a lot of different groups, and then traveling a lot. And I guess in a way, the waymaking perspective emerges, or the navigation, when you see there are so many routes to the one place, in a sense.
Exactly.
The classic old fable of, there's many routes up the mountain. And when you find yourselves invested and enculturated in so many different ways, it starts to seem like, well, there's all these separate paths, right? But in some sense, we're often orienting towards similar things.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
Is it the flexibility of the navigational frame as waymaking then emerges, I guess, because it helps validate all of those different perspectives.
Right, without needing to pit them against each other, but also allowing them to have their differences, right? I mean, I feel like that's a very hard thing, to allow things to be different and even at times seem oppositional from a particular position without having to like cast them in this dichotomous framework, right? Where you have to choose one or the other, which is kind of how that's the Cartesian kind of trajectory, right? That's even part of our language and the way we discuss a lot of things. So I guess I'm trying to break out of that, but what you say, I think, is really, really makes a lot of sense to me, because it sounds like you too were kind of forced to see the world from a lot of different perspectives. I mean, I moved a lot as a kid, for example, and when you go to a new school and you realize like, okay, everything that was cool in my old school is like uncool here, right? Or, there's all these kind of weird shifts where you're just like, oh, the world is like not actually just one way. It kind of depends on what social group you're used to. You learn that, right? If you move a lot as a kid, or even if you're just reading a lot of different kinds of books, you're curious, right? You see that there's all these different perspectives, and it can be sort of jarring, right? You want to almost just choose one so you feel part of something. And I think, that process can be so potent and painful and wonderful. And I think, a lot of what I've been trying to figure out with Waymaking is trying to figure that out, right? How to hold all these positions in a way that makes sense.
Right. The question comes up of how do you make your way when there's so many ways to make, right?
Exactly.
Or so many possible ways.
Yeah.
In a sense, it's the question of meaning. It's, the death of God, right? It's the meaning crisis. So many things kind of inform this kind of discussion.
Yeah, interesting you say that, because Nietzsche, this perspectivalism, right? You said the death of God, and this makes me think of Nietzsche, and a lot of that perspectivalism, like, that has kind of come out of that tradition, which doesn't really reference Nietzsche so much anymore, but like Massima, I can't remember, this idea of many different perspectives. Yeah,
perspectival realism. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
In Guerra,
Yeah, I really like that stance. And it seems to be a stance that, people with the kind of history you've just described feel well accommodated within, including myself. And I think maybe we can get back to this and maybe the political implications or whatever, all the kind of cultural and more interesting implications. But can you bring us back to the notion of waymaking in general, and maybe talk about how you see it as relevant to, something like cognition broadly understood, but maybe something like behavior or memory or perception?
Sure. I think it helps for me to ground it in something I think of as the ecological orientation. And that's not something I came up with. That's a term I use, but I think it actually includes a lot of these traditions, like the one we were just talking about, perspectivalism, but also more like ecological traditions like Gibson, this kind of stuff that people are more familiar with, but also wider, like Rachel Carson's idea that we are a part of nature, and what we do is nature and affects nature. These kind of nestedness, or Gregory Bateson, really you can find a kind of ecological perspective regardless which discipline you go to. And I think that waymaking sort of starts in that tradition where it's that's how I'm grounding this idea of navigation. I call it waymaking because navigation is such a specific term in neuroscience, you probably know, which is what I studied. There's like navigation, wayfinding, all these things, but waymaking just sort of includes everything, right? How we make our way through what we find ourselves in, through the encounter, which is navigation, but it's broader. So that, I feel like, if you think of that as part of this ecological orientation, where we're actually just kind of trying to understand how we're becoming aware of what we're part of and also what's part of us, which is what I think all these different ecological orientations have in common, then you understand waymaking as, okay, it's just measurement from a perspective or a position of this encounter that we're in, and how that itself is like how we make our way through whatever we're trying to make our way through. Like physically, yes, the body has to kind of sensorily process whatever it encounters to kind of move physically. But you can also think of it mentally, right? If you're reading a book, you're processing or you're finding patterns and so on in a similar way. Socially, so waymaking can kind of be applied to any of these like different landscapes. But I think for me, really, it goes back to this ecological orientation, which for me would be about, waymaking, but also nestedness instead of dichotomy, which kind of goes into the complex systems way of thinking, where instead of thinking of opposites, as I was talking about before, you think of kind of scale and nestedness. I think that's more ecological, right? You find that in writers like Rachel Carson, who's talking about us as part of a larger ecology, but you also find it in like really specific philosophical texts. So yeah, if you just think of the ecological orientation and then waymaking as kind of a way of discussing that, that I think applies to all these different disciplines and perspectives. And it's like very much connected to nestedness and also to kind of what I call like expansive thinking or transformative thinking, where you're actually sort of trying to understand other positions than aside from just the one that you already feel like you inhabit.
Yeah, right. So something that comes to mind, I'd be interested to hear your comment here, is in an active frame, they often leverage the notion of sense making, and it sounds like you're doing a similar kind of bait and switch of the notion of cognition for waymaking. And I wonder if you see subtle distinctions there. Part of my own challenge with the notion of sense making has been that it typically refers to the process of maintenance of a particular stability, if you will, and hasn't always, at least in the kind of technical unfolding of it, allowed for novelty in such an easy understanding, or the precise relationality or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it seems like the waymaking approach is already more ecological, even just in terms of the language, right? The kind of the fact that you're moving from a position into something else. But then I wonder, does that necessarily open up a kind of a kind of teleology, which is there already in an action, right? We're acting with respect to some of our goals, but the waymaking for me has a kind of and maybe you can disabuse me of this somewhat, but it has you said you were Hegelian earlier on, right? So there was
I didn't say I was Hegelian. I just said that was my early thesis. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a difference.
So, yeah, is there a sense of like we're making our way towards something, or is it just that we're making our way towards the resolution of the tensions that arise and our concerns and goals? And
yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's why I brought up this idea of nestedness, right, and position, because yes, of course, like there's always a trajectory, but we're so used to thinking in this dichotomous way that we think there's a beginning and an end, right? So there must be some kind of teleology that's somehow objective. And I think that is really the hard point, right? Because somehow we have this ecological orientation, I think, is what I'm trying to present, to show, expresses a different view from that. It's not about beginnings and ends. It's not about opposites. Somehow it's an ongoing dynamic process that we have to try to learn how to think of without putting it in any kind of container, which is very hard for us. And once you do that, and perspectivalism tries to address this too, then you realize from every position, relative to every other position, you will always have a trajectory. It doesn't mean it's teleological in an objective sense. It's just that from that perspective, however that perspective is moving through whatever it's encountering, be it a human or a cell or whatever, there's, of course, a trajectory relative to the other positions. But that doesn't mean that if you move to a different position, the trajectory will be the same or even have exactly the same parameters. Of course, there's the shared overall dynamic movement because you don't have gaps between positions. But, just in the same way that, we were talking about these different paths, you can have incredibly different paths that don't share a lot of regularities, but actually do kind of have a similar pattern or trajectory relative to the whole. So I think that's a very hard way to think, and it's what we try to learn with complex systems and all of this. Like, we're trying to get there. How do we get out of this linear way of thinking? But I do think there's a way in which, from every perspective, you can imagine a kind of teleology or trajectory. I don't think teleology is the right word, but relative to what we're going through in our lives, for example, there is a way in which we're going to have more clarity or more connection, which is kind of what we want. It's what life wants. If we want to get into big questions of why that is and so on, we're going to end up in a kind of state of awe, which I think is okay. But if we're just trying to understand really basic things that matter to our daily lives, I think we can just understand it as we're trying to make our way, and there's many different trajectories. But yes, like, we can understand that relative to wanting connection and clarity and these kinds of things, there might be one trajectory that's better, so to speak. But it doesn't mean that another person's trajectory should look like that exactly. I don't know if that makes much sense, but the sense making, I do want to really, that's a good, I definitely am very moved by a lot of inactive literature, and I really feel like this is very close to all of these ideas. I wouldn't say that like waymaking is inactive just for the reasons we've been talking about, because I think you could see it many different ways. But this idea of sense making, I mean, it is kind of what I'm talking about, right? Like, the body is a sensory body, and it is from our kind of reflective position making sense of everything that it encounters, and that is a kind of waymaking. But I also think Maturana and Varela were already sort of trying to do a little perspectivalism. Cybernetics has a lot of that. Early Varela, this not one, not two idea, that's also this kind of, I think a lot of people are really trying to find a way to think about ecological cognition, but it's very hard, right? Because we're in a position. So it's hard to then understand how there are so many other positions, and how can we talk about that, right, without it fitting into a linear model.
Yeah, there's so much there. I've just recently purchased a book that I haven't got around to reading, but I bought it on the blurb. The blurb was something along the lines of, we're limited beings in an infinite universe, and any phenomena that we might have some interest in, there's going to be multiple perspectives on it, and multiple right perspectives, right, giving the way you're trying to make, in a sense. But that evokes, I suppose, in a scientific culture, in a scientific mind, in a kind of received worldview. It's challenging, I think, in that to maintain the realism dimension. It's more easy to maintain the perspectivalism. The realism, I don't know if it holds in the same way anymore, or how we have validation criteria, or how we start to understand what it is precisely that science is doing, unless we come into this kind of more compatibilist framing as the general framing within which science is done in the first place.
Yes, I think that's why I went back and studied neuroscience in a way, was because there is something about, like, we can understand these ideas in a big way, but we really also need some way to systematize them, or to study them in ways that can somehow actually help us communicate across positions, which ends up being somehow like a mathematical model, or, a lot of what you guys are doing there, actually, where you're really trying to find some kind of technological or computational or, some way of actually formalizing some of these ideas. So yeah, that's I studied neuroscience, and I studied memory in the hippocampus, and I think this actually for example, provides one sort of way into that, because the hippocampus, of course, is known for memory, but it's also known for navigation. So you can kind of look at that. There's a lot of different models, computational models and so on, coming in the last 5 years, which try to understand thinking, memory, and navigation in this kind of scaled or nested way, right? So I think we're getting there. I think a lot of like complex systems, a lot of what you're doing there, I mean, we're trying to find new models for how to understand this and talk about this perspectivalism or this like ecological way of orientation. But it is really hard to get out of this dichotomous mindset, you know, where I think, like, relative to the point you just made, that what feels hard is that we need some way to address like really everyday sort of problems, and just it feels like in our everyday life that we're very separate from everything around us, and that positions are very different. And of course, like, that's at the heart of a lot of our problems, right? Politically and so on. I mean, that there feels like there's always separation and dichotomy. And how do we build sort of models in neuroscience and cognitive science that can actually somehow connect to everyday life in that way? But I actually think it's really possible. It's just that I think the question for me is, how do we understand, like, to get back to realism, which you brought up, that we are obviously, I mean, this is for me the ecological orientation. You can't get out of the movement and dynamism that includes everything, that is the ecological, right? That many authors have talked about as ecological, from anthropology to philosophy, right? They're all sort of trying to get at what you're asking about, like, how do we understand what's real and connected if we don't understand it as separate positions, you know? And that's why I think this ecological orientation, where we try to understand that even though there are many different positions, they're all part of a dynamic movement, right? I think this nestedness and complex systems helps us do that. And even the eruption theory and stuff, because, you know, you can think of it in your own body in the same way that all the cells in your body are separate positions if you want to measure them from the position of a cell, but they're also part of one body. You know, there's no gap, right? It's just, to get back to this nestedness, depends on where you're going to measure from. Are you going to measure from the position of the cell, or are you going to measure from the position of the human body, or the position of like a social group, or the position of a nation? All of those, just like we were saying, are going to look like the trajectories are going to be different, right? But I do think there's a way in which, just like in mathematical complex systems, those things are connected. It's just, how do we find the framework to understand how they're connected? And that actually the whole point is that those positions learn how to share their experience with one another, right? That actually is what we're trying to do here with all of this. So it's hard, because realism is already this dichotomous. It's like already assumes there's an opposite of realism, you know? And I guess what I'm trying to say with the ecological orientation is, like, let's start with the understanding that we're awakening within something. We don't know what it is. Let's call it the ecological, but there's no gaps, right? There's always a trajectory between my position and yours. It's just, how do we find it?
Right. Yeah, I think the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead has been helpful, at least to me, to kind of develop the kinds of intuitions that you're trying to stoke there as well. There's somebody, I forget the author, I'm terrible for forgetting authors, but he talked about the kind of moment he grokked Whitehead's metaphysics, or at least part of it. And Whitehead, of course, has the notion of cosmogenesis and the idea along the lines you're saying, right? We're all evolving together. And this author described it, coming to this intuition in a very strong sense, how we kind of recognize that what Whitehead is describing is this kind of, simultaneous bursting into being in this very moment of all being, right? And that this is a kind of ongoing process that we assume has a bookend and a forward end somewhere, and that we're just moving between them, but actually it's all contained here in the present, right? And the navigation always happens in the present, even if we have some orientation towards the past, the future.
Absolutely. And the only way we can have a trajectory of past, present, and future is through our social relations, through the way we interact with other positions. So it's actually a way of understanding that common, always present movement that feels like it's somehow has a trajectory or that's static, but of course never does, because it's always dynamic. But I love that you bring up Whitehead, because I think that's another really huge thread of this ecological orientation idea, because I mean, I haven't read him as deeply as I think you have, so I would really love to hear even what cosmogenesis is. I don't actually know. Maybe you could tell me. But what I have read of him, and even more what I've read of people who have been influenced by him, like Mark Burkhardt and process philosophy and interactionism, and it's also trying to address the same thing that kind of keeps me awake at night or whatever, or that has kind of motivated me all these years, of how do we really talk about this dynamic process that we're all part of, and we're also trying to kind of somehow understand more of, right? And he, I think, really made a huge leap kind of in finding language to describe it, because that's really what we're trying to do. Try to find the right language to describe it that can maybe one day lead to us being able to model it, because we want to understand it, and then we can model it better in terms of with our technology, which I think is something we both are interested in. But yeah, could you maybe, cosmogenesis, that has no beginning or end either, right? That's basically just this kind of ongoing dynamic change, or is it?
Yeah, I don't know. So for Whitehead, the basic idea is that we're part of this ongoing evolution of the entire cosmos, right? And we're just invested in that and our own evolution, and every thought and word we utter is part of that larger evolution and geared into it in some way. I'm not entirely sure about whether or not he has a starting point, but he does think about, he has a very evolutionary account of the universe, which might imply that he does have a starting point. But for Whitehead, something even like the laws of physics, even like the basic material constituents of the world came into being through some sort of negotiation, right? And he continues that whole story of this kind of participatory negotiation as the evolution of the cosmos into matter, into life, into human beings, and so on. And for him, consciousness at the level of the human being, this is a radical claim for some, but I think it's consistent within Whitehead's framework. For him, that kind of consciousness that you find at the level of the human being is perfectly continuous with this early negotiation, right? It's just a kind of flexibility that you don't find in this basic constituents of matter. But there's something continuous between experience and consciousness with something that's already present in matter. And for Whitehead, even in those material particles, those basic material particles, like whatever that consciousness is always already a relational thing too, right? So it's emerging in the interaction between the atoms. I was just thinking about this today, right? Like, because I had, in OIST, there's, people of various persuasions, and there's, a lot of hardcore scientists, quite reductionists, because they need to be in some sense to do some of the work they're doing and so on. So you get into a lot of good conversations, and one of the conversations I was having today was about this kind of thing in mechanism and, mechanical universe and so on.
Yeah.
And one thought that came to mind was, it was a bit of a ridiculous thought, I know that, but it also felt somehow that it was getting at something interesting. Was, we talk about the basic constituents of matter as atoms, but we never talk about a single atom, right? There's no such thing as a single atom.
Right, great.
So So the atoms are always in relationship, right? Or else there'd be atoms of the atoms kind of thing, and you'd eventually get one atom or something. But that's never the case, and I don't think anybody wants to propose that's the case. So we're already talking about an ecological universe, right? Even in a reductive frame, even if we're not fully acknowledging it.
I think that's a really great point, right? And it actually even kind of points towards how we might somehow be able to get a grip on this, right? That we, of course, need to kind of create these seeming linear oppositional things like atoms, right? That's a label we give to positions, and we need to do that. It is kind of, we are reducing, and we are using this mechanistic mindset, and there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, it's really a helpful tool, But just as you said, we can also kind of go to another scale, right? And see, okay, yes, but they all only make sense when we study or measure them in relation to one another, right? And also, that's only one way that we can reduce it. We could also reduce it many other ways, right? And other kinds of beings could probably reduce it different ways. It's not that there's like some objective thing that is an atom. It's that's a pattern of activity that we've named an atom in order to understand some larger relation, right? But also it's really interesting, you talked about evolution a lot. And I wonder, what your thoughts are on this. Like, does evolution itself like imply this kind of linear or teleological model? I mean, it doesn't imply it, but we seem to assume it, right? Even some of that needs to be rethought a little bit, I guess,
For Whitehead, it definitely didn't, right? Whitehead had this image of like, he leveraged this image that James talked about a lot, where he had this skull from Borneo with all these things hanging off it, and it was all kind of going in different directions. And for Whitehead, that was like a good encapsulation of the nature of this evolution, right? It's bursting off in all these different directions. There's obviously very different accounts of the kind of macro evolutionary story and where it's heading. And some people, mystics like Desjardins would say, we're all heading to this absolute point where we, reach some sort of integrated enlightenment of all beings kind of thing. But then, more grounded accounts, will say, well, we do seem to be working towards some sort of cooperation on a larger scale. And even if there's breakdowns in that at certain times, maybe there's some truth to that. But it's really not a literature that I'm that familiar with, so I don't think I can comment too intelligibly there. But it does seem, someone maybe like Swenson has made the case that, which seems to fit somewhat with the Whiteheadian position, that you have these thermodynamic functions that give rise to these self-organizing dissipative structures that in turn give rise to forms of life and so on. I think a lot of stuff is left out of the question in those kinds of still relatively deterministic accounts, right? Consciousness, for one thing, doesn't seem to have room in that story so much. But
I think it matters what we mean by consciousness. I think that's another word that gets often confused with mind, and I would say it's not the same thing as mind. I don't know what you would think about that, but yeah.
Anyway, what's the distinctions you would make there?
Well, I guess I would try to go back to this idea of waymaking in terms of what you were just talking about, because I think it helps a bit to understand, like, instead of trying to start with some definition of like what the world is or whatever, we can just understand, like, from some position we're trying to make our way through, or that position is making its way through whatever it encounters. If we can just kind of start there, then I would say mind is kind of the technology, in a way, of whatever that position's sensory capabilities are. And it would be different, of course, for a cell than for a human, than for a social group or whatever. And I don't think that's the same thing as consciousness. I think through mind, we become conscious of our consciousness, if that makes sense. So I think often we use this term consciousness as if it means that we're aware of our own consciousness. But actually, I would say any kind of thing that can sense is conscious in a very, very, very basic way. It's like you can't really, I don't see how we separate any kind of sensing from this very basic level of just conscious in the sense that you are somehow sensing something other than your position, right? I mean, a cell has a membrane and all the stuff that's like sensing what from, if we like put our positional measurement as a cell, what is for that cell, its encounter. That for me is like sensing and in life, right? And consciousness. But that's very different from being conscious of consciousness, being reflective, being like, that's not saying the cell is aware of its own sensing. It's sensing, but I think there's a distinction between us being able to kind of reflect on our own consciousness, which I think we do through mind. Like mind is something I think we've developed through waymaking to become aware of ourselves as conscious, or not even only ourselves, but to get back to this ecological orientation, like we are basically becoming conscious. We are life becoming conscious of life in a way. We're not just, becoming conscious of ourselves. It's like you were saying, you don't have one atom, so that kind of consciousness is like, for me, reflective consciousness, different than just this very, very, very simple sensing, which I would also say is kind of consciousness. And I would think of mind as, or even cognition as basically like what we build through making our way through that encounter from this very basic conscious position. So in that way, for me, mind and consciousness are not the same thing. It's more that mind is patterns, the patterns we build, or it's probably better to even say cognition is the patterns we build through making our way through an encounter. So that can be pre-reflective, right? That's just like basic navigation. But it's also cognition from any perspective, position for me. And then you have what I think of it as mind, which is our awareness of those patterns that we've developed to make our way in the world. So then you have a kind of reflective cognition. So I that's kind of complex, but I do think it really helps to pull that stuff apart a bit, because we talk about consciousness as if it's sensing, but also as if it's our awareness of ourselves. And then mind somehow also just gets equated with consciousness. But I really don't think it's helpful to talk about those all as one thing, especially when we try to understand like this ecological orientation of what has cognition, for example, and what has mind and what has consciousness. Those become different answers, right? If we really think harder about what consciousness and mind are. But what do you think? I don't know.
Sure. I actually like your breakdown there. I mean, it's works quite well with the, say, Whiteheadian view too, that there's something very basic, maybe we call it consciousness, and it evolves in a sense, and maybe it gives credence to this kind of perspectivalism we've been talking about before, right? So there's different traditions that have kind of targeted different features of this triadic structure that you're describing. So maybe something like a psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytic tradition works more with what you were calling mind. A cognitivist position works more with what you were calling cognition, and maybe even something like a more contemplative tradition like Buddhism has more interesting reflections on consciousness itself, or maybe an intersection of all of those things. I guess for us here in the unit, we definitely do have this distinction between what we think about as basic consciousness that is in the business of making a difference within otherwise determinate systems. And we're kind of happy to maybe move some of the functionality that you talked about, right, in terms of mind, right, the kinds of tools that emerge, whether that be through the habits of your body or the habits of your thought or whatever gets kind of offloaded to these relatively determinate patterns, right? We can still intervene in them in some way, but they kind of just unfold by themselves a little bit too. That seems to be more in line with what you're calling cognition, and then our ability to reflect on that relationship between the two seems to be more what you're calling mind. Yeah, I think I'll have to think about it a bit more, because you're just introducing me to it. But I do like the distinctions. I mean, these terms are notoriously difficult to kind of discipline anyway. But it is nice to make some effort to do that, just even for ourselves, to have some sort of shared language.
Yes, and I think if we try to do it with an ecological orientation, it does change a bit, because one problem I have with a lot of inactive literature, it's not even a problem. It's just like, it's very hard to get away from this dichotomous way of thinking where we already assume a kind of difference between physical and mental, for example, even as we say we don't. So I really like what you were just saying, because I think like this making a difference, or whatever you said. I think we can try to look at it from a perspective where technology isn't an object, for example. Technology is an action. And I think that kind of connects to understanding mind as an action. Kind of in the way you were saying with the atom, we kind of objectify it or something, right? But actually, we objectify it as a means of understanding it as an action. And I think like this is what we've done with mind. We've kind of objectified this thing, or as a means of trying to understand what is actually this scaled, nested, dynamical action of consciousness or life or whatever, trying to, or not trying to, but developing, right? Making its way. Becoming more aware of itself is one way you could say it, like in a particular tradition, like maybe the meditative tradition, but also the philosophical tradition. Or from a scientific point of view, maybe it's, you would put it in a more practical kind of terminology, but in a sense, it's for me a similar action of trying to make our way through this encounter. And what I see as developing from that is mind and technology. And, I don't see that those are as separate as we think they are. In a weird way, we've objectified mind, and we've also sort of objectified technology. Like we think that we're not responsible for technology because it's somehow outside of us. And I would try to connect it more to mind and say, no, actually, all of this is a scaled sort of process that comes from, the same kind of activity, which is this like trying to make our way through what we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Let's get back to the technology one in a second. And Vervaeke's notion of this psychotechnology is resonating there with me as well. But just to come back to the consciousness thing, maybe we can kind of finish up shortly on the technology question, because I know both of us are interested in that. And maybe some implications or applications of, this Waymaking position. But so Evan Thompson classically uses the kind of metaphor of the, cognition or consciousness, or I'm not quite sure what definition he would draw between those two. But for him, it's something that emerges in the same way that flight emerges in the relationship between the bird, its wings, and its environment. And that seems to me kind of what you're suggesting there, right? This relational, it's even hard to call it something, this relational, set of processes or whatever.
Well, that's beautiful. I love that from Thompson. I love this idea of mind and life and being continuous with. I think all of that I'm really on board with. I guess there's a little something different, I would say, is like in the example you just gave, yes, the flight is or how did you say it exactly again? The bird, the flight is
the flight is not in the bird as such, it's in the relationship between the wings and the bird and the environment.
Right, but then there's also this other level which we've become aware of the flight. Do you know what I'm saying? So we're now sort of talking about flight as if it's an object, but that itself is another kind of flight, I mean, it's another activity or process. So I think that's where it gets, like, there's all these scales, right? It's not just one or the other or linear. So there's many, like, it's all action, right? It's just that from some position, we need to objectify it as the bird, for example. The bird is also action, and the flight is the action to understand it. But from another position, we could also understand the bird as a kind of action that has come ecologically. So I guess what I'm saying is, can we find a way where we can still talk about things as linear, as objective, or as objects, not objective, as positions, as atoms, while at the same time we understand we're doing that heuristically? That's our way of trying to understand what is always dynamic action.
Yeah, I think actually I kind of lose sight of it every now and again, but like Whitehead really did develop a lot of tools to help us do this kind of thing.
I think so. Weirdly, I mean, I'm not a Hegelian, but I think the thing I like about Hegel is that he in a way, his writing sort of tries to demonstrate this action. So this weird kind of thing that we call dialectic and all of this, I mean, it's, if you try to just think of it as a demonstration of this constant kind of switching and scaling of position that is possible, and the way it's kind of always dynamically changing. I think you find that also in Marx, you find that in Nietzsche, you find that in, a lot of people, Whitehead definitely, where they're almost demonstrating the process with their language, because it's very hard to say, it's very hard to use a language that is developed linearly to talk about nonlinear or ecological movement, right? But we're finding a way, I think.
We were reading a text on, there's a process philosophy and biology recently together, and there's somebody who mentioned within that text that if we were really to put our cards on the table and adopt the language that would help us think through these things, right? Everything's a verb all of a sudden, right? So the table is tabling,
Absolutely.
The cat is catting, and that just seems like we're fated not to get there, so we're stuck with this kind of language, and we can, in certain instances where it feels somehow doable, like languaging, right? We use that kind of language somewhat. We get kind of reminders of these things, but the likelihood that we're going to, inculcate an entire culture within the sciences or beyond with this kind of language, well, maybe it's, language does change, and things that feel awkward in one generation don't feel so awkward in the next, and who knows where it'll go. But
it does.
I mean, what's your thoughts in terms of actually having to get to that point to really, kind of come to grips with these intuitions, I guess, in a very fundamental way that would actually, I think, gear us back into the world in that way, right? I know there's indigenous cultures that will use that language much more, right? Because they, as you said earlier on, feel that they are part of the thing as much as they are observing the thing.
I think that's a really great point. I'm so glad you said this about the verb too, because I think a lot of people in different disciplines are starting to kind of talk in a similar way to that, to say, yeah, everything really is a verb, obviously, and it kind of does go back to this way of how we make things into nouns in order to understand them. And even our language, it's a verb. It's a dynamic thing. It's like we've created these kind of symbols and representations that we use to communicate, but there's no actual object that's that's language either. So yes, I mean, I think we're trying to find a way, right, to kind of understand that everything is dynamic and ecological and a verb, but the way that we are able to understand that thus far is to create these these models that pretend to be static and nouns, right? I think we're all trying to kind of find a way to do that. And actually just being able to become aware of it the way we are right now and the way many people are starting to talk about it, that is itself like changing, right? In this scaled kind of manner. Like we are actually already something new, you know? It's not new in the sense that, like, of course, the first people in the world were already aware of it, but it's new in that we're becoming able to talk about it and actually like look at it and observe it for what it is, you know, kind of in this way of the bird and the flight, and then we observe the flight and the bird. Like there is a way in which we're reflecting on it differently. And that, I think, can change more practical things like scientific models, political systems, and probably it actually comes back to how we see ourselves, which again is why I always try to come back to this ecological orientation, because I think part of it is also we're trying to develop a different understanding of what we think a self is and an I. Like, you know, what is our kind of, can we have different orientations? Can we somehow not be the bat, you know, in terms of like this paper about, you know, of course we can't be the bat, we can't think like a bat, but we do develop tools and technologies to better understand what that sensory position is that we call a bat. And I think we also develop books and art and music as a way to try to better understand other human positions. And also in science, like a lot of science, we're trying to better understand what it's like to be the bat. What is it like to be the bat? But what is it like to be the tree? What is it like to be, you know, like this is kind of what we're all trying to do, is how do we figure out how to share positions? And maybe that means that we're going to change how we define self. You know, maybe I'm not a separate I living in a skull. You know, maybe that comes back to this embodied thing of waking up to our embodied, emplaced position in an encounter and trying to understand other positions. And that actually changes the overall dynamic, doesn't it? You know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, fantastic. I love the idea that it resonates with something I had someone on this podcast say before, Fred Cummins. He talked about, you know, how science is in some sense also a kind of wisdom tradition, right? And it's inquiring into the world around it from what it is to be an embodied being in a world surrounded by other embodied beings, right? And how you described what is it to be a tree, and our science facilitating our understanding of that, right? For instance, recently we have this kind of awareness of underground
root systems,
yeah, the root systems and the whole I forget what it's called.
The fungi.
The fungi. Let's go with that. the
mycelium.
World Wide Web, the mycelium networks. That's what we're after.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it has an amazing kind of and it's not just for people in the sciences, right? Once people hear that there's this kind of sophisticated communication going on that has these kind of strange caring dimensions and acts not unlike how we act in our best moments or whatever, there's a kind of a degree of empathy that's extended to those living systems as well, right? That isn't in the absence of that knowledge, right? So it does seem in some sense that what we're doing with our sciences is kind of, in some weird way, re-enchanting the world, right?
Yeah, in a way, our awareness of the tree is the tree's awareness of itself. If you really think of it in this kind of ecological tradition, it doesn't have to be mystical at all. It's just, if we really just grant something very simple, that we are part of life, whatever we want to define life as, this kind of mind or cognition, this way that we've become reflective, isn't just a reflection on an eye that's inside of a skull and a brain, you know. It's a reflection on what life, what this encounter is. And I think Fred Cummins in this idea of this embodied framework, right, where that does actually, I think there's something very beautiful about thinking of embodied as also a scaled process, right? If we think of this embodied as a kind of framework, what does it really mean to be embodied? That also starts to get at how are we able to share what we sense, and how are particular positions able to become aware of the larger bodies they are a part of, right? So there's not just one body. There's a cell body, but the cell body is part of a tissue, which is part of an organ, which is part of a human. And it's no different for us, right? We're embodied in this kind of tradition that we talk about, but there's another kind of way in which we're becoming aware of larger bodies, right? Which includes all that stuff with the trees, and how understanding how they work actually gives us insight into how we work. This is this kind of fractalized, nested scaling that's always going on, where the more you become aware of your own trajectory, which you only do, as you said, through discussion with other people, right? Like the atoms, they don't mean anything unless they're in connection, right? That is how we become aware of our own trajectory. But we're also, of course, becoming aware of like patterns that are present ecologically, and it goes both ways, right? We can become aware of ecological patterns that seem to be outside of us, but then give us insight into our own our own position, our own sensory experiences, which for me relates a lot to habits, right? And these regularities, and a lot of the work that you do actually, where we build up these habits, and they're never individual habits. They're always somehow part of a larger, like almost fractalized system of patterns. And yeah, I think that's very rich, right? To try to understand how all our many endeavors are trying to kind of like discover these patterns and communicate about how they overlap and connect these different paths.
Yeah, and fall into their production and reproduction and diversion. And one term I've been playing around recently is sympraxis, right? This kind of doing together, this kind of
I don't know that sympraxis. Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
So there's somebody had coined the term sympoiesis as a kind of alternative to autopoiesis.
Oh yeah, wow.
And I was playing around with autopraxis, which I think is kind of helpful as well in the context of habits. When I was thinking the notion of sympraxis as a kind of doing together.
That's funny, because I was thinking of like, how we have like cyborgs. I was thinking of like symborgs or symbionts. Like I like this SYM. Yeah. But actually it's great you brought that up, because autopoiesis and autonomy relates a lot to what we're talking about here too, right? And some of the problems with that, where it's that dissonance again of how do we have a part and a whole, a part that's ecological, and where, I think some of that is what we were talking about. Like, so the answer to some of that is understanding that's a heuristic. That's autonomy is like the atom. It's like we need to do that to understand what is not like ever, fully autonomous. So the sympraxis kind of addresses that better.
Yeah, that was my hope for it. But I think someone like De Paula Ezekiel might say, well, autonomy for them is and always has been a relational notion. It's just to say that we can, in some sense, mark out a level of description or a kind of scale of interest at which something individuates that's, worthy of explanation in its own right, if you will. Which is not to say that it doesn't participate in larger autonomies, or that it's not constructed by multiple coordinating smaller autonomies, but that there's some sort of level of emergence there that's kind of relevant.
Right, I think that's very important. But also, just if we put it in a nestedness or ecological scale, you would realize that it's not the distinction of autonomy could also be that could be parameterized in a really different way from a different position, for example. So that, it becomes a little bit more of a tool and a way that we're trying to understand things, instead of this like very hardcore kind of, this is, everything is has to be seen like this autonomous system is an autonomous system from every position. Maybe not.
Yeah, that's a good point actually, and a good reminder. We did a conference here recently, ECOGS conference, with a bunch of people from the embodied cog scene, whatever you call it, and we had a question which came from this text. Maybe you know the text, but it's can social interaction constitute social cognition? It was Hannah Dieger, Ezekiel De Paulo, and Sean Gallagher from 2010.
Yes.
And Sean was at the conference, so it was interesting to see him engage with these questions. But we had the notion in that paper, they kind of tease out distinctions between contextual, enabling, and constitutive elements in any sort of phenomena of interest. And we did some workshops where we kind of took these definitions, looked at some of the examples they provided, and then tried to look at phenomena through the lens of these different distinctions and see if we all agreed actually that there was, these clear distinctions between them. And they are helpful distinctions, that's definitely true, but you start to realize much of whatever you value in the distinction is informed by a lot of presuppositions, right? Like, what is the scale of the phenomenon of interest? Precisely the thing you said, right? If we broaden the system of interest that also includes this thing, all of a sudden this might be a contextual where it was previously a constitutive or whatever. So there's always this kind of perspectival bracketing of some other sets of interacting parts or components or whatever that we do. And I guess within well-defined scientific paradigms, it's just that these are agreed upon up front in some sense, right? Like, in a very reductivist mechanistic approach, everybody, say, working on that particular problem has some set of background assumptions that are unquestioned and that are informing how they're able to, carve out the space in agreed terms. And once you become conscious of that, it makes your scientific endeavors quite difficult, right? Because you have to both agree where the phenomenon starts and ends and actually integrate this knowledge that you are standing in a kind of second order relationship to this thing and that, it could be otherwise and so on.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that's such an important point. Also, it's good to bring up Gallagher because he's another important writer in all of this. But yes, it does come back to this, like how that basically what you just described is the problem of interdisciplinarity, like trying to be interdisciplinary, right? How hard that is to kind of, because it's just as you said, I think another important word here is development, right? And this also connects to these kind of habits and patterns. So in the same way that you're sort of born into an encounter and the way that your sensory body deals with that encounter is going to build your patterns and your habits, which we will call cognition. That's a trajectory. You're making your way and you have a trajectory. And it's very similar when we think of disciplines, right? If you're coming from a very particular, like, they're not opposites, but in the past have been kind of called opposites, like inactive versus something like a more analytic sort of style where, not embodied. Like, those are not opposites, but they've been thought of as opposites. And the reason they feel like it is because you develop very differently. You read completely different texts. Sometimes it's changing now, but in different disciplines, you come up reading particular texts and you learn particular words mean particular things. And another kind of trajectory could be using those same words in a very different way. So it becomes really hard when you're trying to be interdisciplinary and open up and then like take in all these different trajectories because you have so much to learn, right? Like you have to try to, as you were saying, distinguish what the trajectory is in order to just understand. Maybe you're talking about exactly the same thing. You're just using different words for it that you've learned from different texts. It happens a lot, I think.
Sure.
But I think this is where actually we're in a good position now because of technology, because it's becoming much easier to get a very good overview of a trajectory we can clarify these kinds of things, just that we're becoming aware of them in the same way of, becoming aware that everything is a verb. That awareness actually can help us create technology that takes this into account, right? So that if you're just aware from the beginning that you're both trying to solve a similar problem, for example, with an anthropologist and a philosopher or whatever, but that you're coming at it from different trajectories, we can maybe create technology that helps us get a better view of what those trajectories are without melding them into the same thing, letting them be different, but not opposites, right? And then we can start to see how they're kind of scaled or different pattern. Like there's a lot of patterns that probably overlap there, right? And we can get to this more ecological orientation instead of this like, okay, it's linear, it's either this or that. Maybe there's just many different paths. There's a lot of overlapping patterns. And how we communicate about that is how we're going to create new trajectories and paths, right? So yeah, it's really important what you say. And I think it gets back to why technology is so important and why trying to create models and being able to think of nouns and these static things as tools is so important right now, because it really gets back to what you were just saying, like trying to understand how we could be talking about similar things with very different vocabularies of development, That's kind of, in a way, if we can really address that, like think of how many very, very big problems in all disciplines that would help, just a little bit of clarification and a little bit more help in connecting, with other people and other disciplines, other ideas.
Yeah. So many of these conversations, I think, find their way back to this place, right? Mm-hmm. And to me, this place it's a place about a kind of education of sorts. How do we educate ourselves, as Zach Stein talks about, for a time between worlds, right? There's this kind of liminal space that has opened up with all of these possibilities and all these valid looking frameworks and all these approaches and all these ways, and somehow we have to navigate actually the relationship between all those, or mediate the relationship between all those. I don't know exactly what the education would look like, but it's when I think what it might include, and we go back to the start of our conversation and we talk about maybe something that has enabled us, for better or worse, right? I'm not claiming some sort of superiority here, right? But has enabled us some sort of flexibility of positioning. I think both of us agreed that part of that was the immersion in different types of communities and groups and practices. Mm-hmm. And maybe our technologies, it's not so much about what the technology looks like or, the precise ergonomics, or it's about the affordances for these types of interactions, right? Because maybe we were lucky. I don't know about your situation, but I just needed to leave home when I was like 17 and finish school. Not my home, but my area. I needed to get out. It was so small. And I just kept traveling. But not everybody has that opportunity. I realized that was very privileged, even just to go the small distances I went. But more people do have these opportunities to, get access to these kind of rich communities and this diverse communities online. And maybe some way of encouraging and promoting that will be part of that educational piece.
Mm-hmm. I think there's so much there. I think, I'm not sure what made you decide you needed to move, but I imagine it was probably that you were reading certain things or listening to certain things, or there was probably some kind of motivational creativity that had inspired you to want to see or experience the world a little bit differently.
Yeah, when I think about it now, it was a kind of loneliness, I guess. It was like a desire to connect with other people and therefore certain parts of myself that weren't available in, a very small rural community. I mean, I was surrounded by lovely people, but this sense of like wanting this part of myself to be emerged or expressed or,
Yeah.
So that was the initial impulse, right? And I didn't expect to realize this traveling as an education in and of itself, but that's precisely what it was.
Yes, and I think a lot of people feel that on different levels. Like we feel like there are certain patterns, right, that resonate with us more than others, right? Just as a position, I think however you're kind of come into the world, the way that you sense the world, you're going to resonate with different patterns. And sometimes those patterns around you start to feel constraining, and that you need other ones, right? So what you say there makes me think of two different things, right? Like one, how do we help each other understand that it's okay? This kind of insight I had, that there are many different kinds of worlds, right? And there are many different ways of being. And one isn't necessarily any better than the other, but maybe the way that you're experiencing your encounter, you're going to have to go a different route than the people around you are going. That can be so scary and hard, right? And a lot of people, I think, just try to conform and go with the patterns they see around them, even if they kind of don't resonate with those patterns, because it's so hard to get this kind of insight, which is what you were describing, that actually it's okay to kind of try another trajectory, and it's not any better or worse. It's just that the people most intimate to you at this moment might not understand that trajectory. So you might have to feel lonely and go at it by yourself for a while, but then maybe you can find a way to kind of connect those paths over time. I mean, I don't know if that's happened for you, but for me, I also quite young felt really isolated and lonely and so on, because I had all these thoughts that I felt like the people around me didn't have or didn't care about. They were on different paths, perfectly fine paths, but I, for whatever reason, probably because of what I'd read and because I'd moved so much, I had these kind of other, I was sensing the world a little bit differently, and I needed to follow other trajectories. And when I did that, I felt even more isolated from the people around me. But over time, I've found, I don't know about you, that you can find kind of paths that connect all of that. And in a way, that's kind of what you're trying to do. That's what I've been trying to do. That's where you start to feel your motivation, you know? It ends up coming back to that. Like you want to connect, and you're trying to find new ways to do it. Weirdly, you have to be lonely sometimes at first to kind of get enough courage to kind of, pursue that.
Yeah, and weirdly, you have to become a philosopher in order to actually make the integration happen.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe not in a traditional way, but...
Yeah, I don't think it's a necessity for those people out there who are, moving amongst the paths. But
no, maybe you become a musician or an artist, or maybe you study trees. I think there's many different ways to kind of address it. For us, it's been philosophy.
Right. And my friend Mog always talks about research is me-search. And I think that's...
It is, right? Yeah, but we're ecological, so,
Yeah, totally. I want to kind of tell you a story that was kind of at the basis of my PhD work, because I think it speaks to to what we're talking about. So when I left school and moved around a lot, and I was playing music, and I was trying to busk on the streets and make money that way and work in different jobs and all that kind of thing. So I found myself like in the company of very, very different communities from time to time. And, I'd have to work as a laborer to make money. So then I'd be away from the arts community, but then I'd be, hanging around with hippies and artists and so on, and, always moving between them. And anyway, I became like, I became sensitive to the fact that like I was falling into ways of being with these people that kind of reflected the norms of the group, right? And it would happen relatively quickly. Even, I'd take up a gait, or my accent would change a little bit, or whatever it was. And anyway, long story short, this happened for years and years, and eventually went back to college and, got this kind of insight into philosophy and psychology, and didn't see the kinds of tools there to help me make sense of what I was trying to make sense of, which was this kind of social constituents of cognition and how I would just fall into patterns of being together. Anyway, I went back to Australia at some point, started working on a mine just to make money to go and do my master's. And I found myself in this situation often where I would like be in the company of different people with whom I have like mutually exclusive histories of interacting. You know, they don't know each other, they both know me, and now we're all present together. Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm quite different around different people. And you know, this sense of not knowing what to do, not knowing who I am, and the whole like notion of self is kind of challenged in that instance, right? And it was that I came back from Australia with. It was like, this is something, right? This is something weird and interesting. And, you know, psychology, as I understand it, doesn't really account for it. And I kind of shopped around a bunch of people to do my master's with. And it was Fred who kind of lit up when I brought this explanation or this example to him. You know, there was something in it. There was a starting point, and it was something we can all share and something we can kind of recognize. Yeah, that's happened to me too. You know, I talked to everybody about it during my PhD, and people had a really visceral reaction to this kind of experience. They're like, yeah, that's the worst.
Yeah. I mean, I'm having it right now as you talk. I understand. Yeah. I mean, it's so true. It's so true that it makes sense, right? I mean, you probably know this. I mean, you studied, you probably developed this, but just hearing you talk, like you really do connect to different trajectories depending on who you're around. So you do kind of become, you're not a different person, but different parts of you are coming out and you're expressing yourself differently. And it can be so alienating, right? If you don't know how to deal with that. If you, for example, just like, I mean, I think in a very simple way, people experience it when they like go away to college or they move to a new town or something, and you develop new patterns. It's new sensory stuff. It's new conversations. It's new books. And then you go back home and you feel like completely like an alien or like you can't connect, you know? But yeah, this happens in a lot of different ways in life. It's fascinating that you connected that to habits. And then did you see this kind of social or interactivism or inactivism as a kind of possible way of addressing that, of being able to hold all those positions in one space?
Yeah, so you know, the accounts of social cognition that were kind of on the table were things like simulation theory, these very cognitivist positions, and they didn't entail the kind of sense of resonance that was so powerful in that experience. You know, the kind of like, well, my body's doing it before anything else. I'm just drawn into it. I can't help it, right?
Absolutely.
Those experiences don't, like, they force you into this reflective position when you're in that like double experience, right, with the two people. But when you're just present to each of those people on their own, you just fall into the patterns, and there's a kind of intercorporeality, right, that takes up whatever it is that was there previously. So yeah, an action and participatory sense making and coordination dynamics at least helped me to, you know, start making sense of some of that. But I guess why I thought it might be interesting to introduce, at least in part, is because I think, you know, when we talked about the educational piece and the moving and the, you know, and so on, like it's difficult and uncomfortable to put yourself in some of these positions. But actually, in a sense, the kind of the meta stability that's necessary to be able to navigate the kind of perspectival position or the kind of world between worlds that we're talking about can be kind of practiced, right? It's like, how do you hold the awkward space, you know, even if you're seeking its reduction in some sense, right? You're moving with time in the direction in which you're better able to collaborate or cooperate. For a time being, you might have to hold this very awkward space. And I think in these kinds of interactions, if we allow ourselves, it can kind of give rise to that. But much of our technologies today seem to be like streamlining the kind of awkwardness out of much of the interaction. And I wonder...
that's a good point, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen an article, I saw an article some while ago that was kind of took all these various technologies that have gained popularity from, you know, delivery services to I don't know, like, anyway, just saying that the kind of unifying feature of a lot of these technologies, unfortunately, was that it was minimizing social interaction and the awkwardness that comes with it.
Yeah, this is a really good point, because that's kind of what happens, right, with most social media, where you just sort of get into a trajectory that then you don't see it as a trajectory. It's supposed to be like the whole kind of space, right? I mean, two things that kind of come up for me is, one, what you're saying. I mean, there is also this kind of meditative tradition that's like become a lot more present. I mean, at least in like this Western culture that I'm part of, now there's this kind of big awareness of mindfulness and meditation. And I think that is, on a hopeful note, kind of the opposite of the siloing of social media, where there is also a way in which we're trying to kind of understand how to hold the space, how to just kind of be aware of our mind. And that's kind of a way of doing what you said, like learning how to hold the awkwardness and learning that it's okay. I mean, I think a lot of it is just being, like, it took me a while, I don't know about you, to even find people and find or just notice that actually there's a lot of people who are trying to hold that awkwardness and who are trying to kind of like have many different selves, their scientific self, their philosophical self, their spiritual self, in one space. Like, some of it's just this awareness that there's not only one way of navigating, and it's okay to hold the space and play around with it a little bit in the way that we were talking about earlier, where everything is a verb, but you can kind of look at these different models and play around with them and learn from them. I think there's that kind of thing happening now, but then the social media is the opposite of that in a way, or not only social media, but a lot of the way we think of technology, the way we use technology, does the opposite. It tries to streamline you. I mean, technology itself, the way it's created, is to kind of addict you to it. And that is very much tying you to a trajectory, not opening space so that you see that there's many different possibilities.
Right.
Yeah, and for me, that goes back to what we talked about a bit earlier too, was this idea of how we've objectified technology. So we think of it as something separate from us, and somehow that allows us to create things that do this, that narrow us rather than open up the space, because we've just said, oh, it's just technology. But no, actually, that's kind of, it's something we're responsible for. If we're going to create technology that limits us and close down our understanding of the possibility of open space and many trajectories, we should realize we're making those decisions, right? Like, we're actually the ones narrowing our trajectories. It's not just that there's like technology that's doing that, So I guess that gets back to why I want to think of technology as an action that's actually very much connected to cognition, not as an object. But I don't know. Do you see there's some distance between these kind of different movements of like towards meditation and mindfulness, and then also like this very, very intense focus on technology in terms of social media when it comes to identity? Or how do you think of technology there, in general, like objectified or?
No, I think we've, tried to adopt, a kind of anthropological stance, a constitutive stance to technology and cognition. I guess for a long time, I was somewhat alienated, I think, from my technological relation. And I think that's quite common, especially in the West. In Japan, that's less so, I think. And there's probably good historical reasons and so on for that in Japan, but they definitely have a slightly different relationship to technology, or a quite different relationship to technology here. But yeah, I think there was some strange sense of technology as a thing over there. It's an object that I engage with at some moments in my life, but it's not really something that interests me that much. And it certainly didn't interest me philosophically for a long time. And then COVID came around, and then my work had been on, recurrent interaction and social dynamics and embodied intersubjectivity. And all of a sudden it was like, well, kind of like keeping up this rich social life, even in the absence of any of this, like, unmediated face-to-face interaction. And I was like, oh yeah, this technology thing really is kind of important, isn't it? And, and then once you start paying attention to it, it's kind of everywhere, and you start to see just how constitutive it is and how much of our cognition is scaffolded by these technologies and so on. So I'm really interested at this point to think about, like, it's very easy, and it happens a lot within embodied approaches and phenomenological approaches and critical approaches to just denigrate technology on the whole, almost like just this strange thing that we don't really care about. And I think most of that comes from this alienated position to it. But then, thinkers like Gilbert Simondon, help you understand or grasp, or even Stiegler, people who've worked in this area for a long time, grasp just the degree to which anything that's emerging or evolving as part of me or as part of our relationship is already prefigured by the techniques that work in that relationship also, and are part of it in some sense. And once you grasp that, right, there's some sense of, well, I can't be alienated, and I can't just live in a critical relationship to it. I have to kind of take the bull by the horns, if you will, and say, well, how can we, configure this or move this towards, or make it part of our own waymaking, right, in a way that we want to move towards something that's ameliorative or better for us, or, better for the planet, or whatever it is. And there's a kind of solutionism there, and I know that's true, and I can't get away from that. I'm kind of, an engineering type person, maybe just from my background, working on mechanics and stuff like that. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think solutionism can come in many different forms. And, if you're not providing the solutions, I mean, somebody else is providing something, and it may not be as much of a solution as might come from, genuinely trying to do that. So yeah, my interest in technology at this point is thinking about, kind of mediators of well-being, something like psychological flexibility. We talked about this at the workshop, and how technology might be an enabler of that kind of thing as well. And once you turn your attention to it, interesting thing comes forth, right? So even, for instance, thinking about breakdowns in the technological mediation, and how people who've engaged with technology for a long time are much more patient around those breakdowns. For instance, we had 2 or 3 breakdowns today, which would have been, catastrophic for my parents, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
But for us who are now, our cognition is partly constituted by these types and forms of mediation. We have a kind of built up a tolerance and a flexibility for them, which I think probably has some generalizability, right? So that's just one example, but it's like, well, we just think about these things as annoying breaking down machines, and, they're not working when we want them to work. And it's like, well, maybe they're actually, have these other dimensions or possibilities built in as well.
Yeah, which is kind of what you were saying too, about being able to see there's many different routes and paths and ways to do something. So if you just think there's only one way for something to work, then you're going to panic probably more than if you already have the experience. Well, okay, that didn't work, so we can try this, and it'll be fine. But I really like what you were saying about the technology, because it reminds me of I think I said at the beginning, like I've come at like these topics in a kind of unorthodox way, which a lot of that has had to do with writing about issues of transportation, but it does connect back to this waymaking, because how we move in the world, and like the technology we create to help us better move in the world. For me, that really is a matter of how we develop mind, I mean, if you think of a bicycle or a car or an airplane, and how this has changed all this social connection, right? How the atoms connect, how we can communicate, and who and what and where we can communicate. it becomes, for me, incredibly fascinating, right? To think about how this technology, like how we create different ways to move, actually creates different cognitive paths, different possibilities for mind. And that's very true now in terms of virtual ways, like we're now creating these kind of technologies that allow us to connect and communicate like we're doing now in ways that are remarkable, right? As remarkable as the first airplane in terms of space and time, to go back to space and time. Like we're really changing our connection with space and time right now, and with the possibility of understanding different trajectories, different ways in life. And you can't like separate the technology from the way that's changing our cognition. And I think becoming aware of that is actually, very helpful in terms of thinking about what kind of technology do we really want to create, because we're creating our possibilities for connection and our possibilities for thinking and feeling and remembering. So like if we want to create technologies that just addict kids when they're 8 years old and make them think that they have to like fit to a very specific kind of way of being in the world, look like a particular way and all of these things, we can create those, and make a lot of money. But maybe we would also like to give those kids technology that helps them understand, there's like many different ways of being in the world. I can orient many different ways. I can call myself many different things and try out different possibilities of self in a safe space, right? And not feel so judged. I mean, that's what you and I kind of wanted, and we went our routes to find a way to find our own path and then reconnect with others. So like, I'm sure, I hope that we can create technology that helps facilitate that for those kids that are, going through that right now. It feels like it's a lot harder if you don't have someone to tell you it's okay to look at different trajectories. If you just get on social media in your little small world and everyone says something bad about you, it feels a little bit like what you were just saying with the panic that our parents might have with technology, where it's just like, oh my God, like my life is over because all these people hate me. So yeah, it would be great if we could find a way to open that space, right? And it's a cognitive space, but I think probably the way we're going to open it is through like new forms of technology.
Yeah, I love that. and I think it's quite inspiring, actually. I think we've got somewhere in this conversation that's quite interesting, and it's going to inspire.
We have a lot in common, I guess.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time here, and I'm conscious of the fact that I'm also running out a bit of steam because it's
it's been a while. A couple hours we've been talking now.
Yeah, it flies by. So maybe we'll wrap it up, Andrea, but I'm happy to have you back on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you again. It's been great.
Yeah, well, let's put it out there, see how it sits for people, see if we get some feedback, and yeah, we can always do it again. But do you have some contacts for people to get in touch?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at my website and there's my email address and everything. It's just my name, AndreaHiott.net or .com. There's also this ecological orientation website that sort of, it's just getting started, but I would love any feedback or like, I'm trying to connect with a lot of different kinds of ideas of what ecological is. So you can also, that's ecologicalorientation.com.
Okay, nice. And you mentioned you had a couple of books, which we never really
I have a bunch of books too, but you can also find those on my website and stuff.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we'll link to some of that stuff in the show notes anyway.
Okay.
But yeah, just say thanks again, Andrea. It was really great chatting to you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Mark. You opened up a lot of new ideas for me, so thanks.
Thank you. Okay, bye, Andrea.
Bye.